Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Factory Must Grow, episode 12. Today we're flying solo again with Twitch chat chiming in with important corrections if I'm wrong about things, which I usually am wrong about something. And we'll be getting into some fun stuff today. We'll start with a mod spotlight as usual. We'll discuss the new Factorio Friday facts, which are very exciting. It's actually going to be a big part of our podcast today, and then we'll get into kind of a second topic of innovation in the genre, because today's Friday facts actually lead to a very interesting game design discussion and some new mechanics that don't really exist in most factory games. So it's a little bit of a combined main topic today. And before we dive into the show, I want to thank all of the patrons and supporters of The Factory Must Grow. All of the patrons of Krydania get a special Discord color, and the $10 and up tiers get access to a special channel, which is fun, called the Channel Planning Team, and you get little sneak peeks and a little bit of input on what I do, and often I'll put little, like, would you prefer I do A or B or C, and little polls and stuff like that. So just fun little rewards. And you can also support the podcast directly now. There's a new option that Spotify has. Spotify does not get a cut as far as I'm aware, which is pretty cool. And you should be able to find a link to that in the About section of the podcast. So that is another option if you don't want to use Patreon to support the show. As always, thank you for considering supporting the show, but no pressure, of course. And next week, another announcement here that's pretty exciting is we are going to be doing a question and answer episode, a Q&A with Galdoc. And so Galdoc and I are going to be co-hosting a Q&A episode. And if you would like to submit a question for us to talk about, please throw that in the Krydania Discord or in Galdoc's Discord, or leave a comment if you're watching the YouTube VOD version of this on the Krydex Extra channel. Let me know what questions you have for us. It can be anything, off topic. Ask us anything. But the general topic will, of course, be automation and factory gaming, because that is the world that we live in with this podcast. But, ask us what burritos we like. Whatever you feel like asking, we'll get to as many questions as we can, and it should be a lot of fun. That will not be at the normal time. It will be Monday, June 17th, rather than Sunday, June 16th at 11:30 EST, which would be 3:30 UTC. So we look forward to seeing you all there. And again, let us know what questions you have that we can talk about on the podcast. So moving on to the mod spotlight, today I wanted to get into one that I don't think we've talked about much yet, and it kind of lines up with our topic today is Factorissimo 2. Now, it's really just Factorissimo. The first one was kind of rewritten very soon after its creation, and so it's really, Factorissimo is just what people call it, but they're talking about Factorissimo 2 on the mod portal, and it was made by Magma McFry in April of 2017, which means it's already over 7 years old, which is crazy to me, and it has over 250,000 downloads. So it's definitely a well-known mod in the community, but I still really want to talk about it because it adds such interesting gameplay. And I also need to mention that there is a fork from Not Melon, another mod creator, that is probably the one you want to download nowadays, because it has been updated to fix a few bugs, as well as take advantage of some updates they added to the Factorio engine. So it's far more performance friendly, which with Factorissimo in particular, it does matter if you're heavily using it. So make sure to get the Factorissimo 2 Not Melon fork if you go and download this yourself. But what even is this mod? Well, essentially it creates the ability to kind of have a Harry Potter, Mary Poppins type bag, where it's bigger on the inside than the outside. So it's like a bag of holding. You make a little factory building that's only 6x6, I think. I'm trying to remember. No, they're a little bigger than that, I think. Maybe 8x8 for the smallest one. So they're fairly large, but, they're still not huge. They're a little bigger than a refinery. And when you walk into the door of the building, all of a sudden you're transported to a very large room. And the way that this works is it essentially teleports you to another surface. But in terms of the gameplay, you can stuff a lot of production and processing into this space, and you can connect belts from inside the building to outside the building. And you can also connect chests or pipes or, other things like circuit connections. So you can pretty much do anything. It can be a little fiddly sometimes to get it all to work right, but more or less you can just stuff a lot more processing in a small space. And what makes it fun is that you kind of have to fit all of your production buildings that you want inside that square space. And it gives you some really cool spaghetti moments. And I think I've really enjoyed when I've played with this mod, the challenge of fitting what you want inside that space and also having to fit the belt connections, to the proper spaces on the outside of the factory building. Because, for example, if you're inputting a belt on the bottom left on the outside of the building, then the belt shows up on the bottom left when you're on the inside of the building. And since it's bigger on the inside than the outside, belts that are adjacent on the outside are really like 3 or 4 squares apart on the inside. And so there's just a lot of cool challenges and stuff like that. And these are somewhat expensive to build, but not prohibitively so. I think the first tier is like a bunch of stone brick and maybe steel or something. I don't remember the vanilla cost because I haven't played this mod with vanilla in a long time. And there are 3 tiers of them. So as you go through the research tree, you get larger ones that are, a few tiles bigger in the main world, but then they're like 8 or 10 tiles bigger on each side square on the inside of the building. And by the time you get to the 3rd tier factory building, you have quite a large space on the inside to build. Another important note is that there are options for both nesting and recursion, which I would say completely change the flavor of the mod. If you're turning those off, then it still gives you a lot of extra space. But since you can't put factory buildings inside of factory buildings, it's really just kind of like, okay, I can fit a medium-sized steel production smelting, inside of one of these buildings. So I have iron coming in the left and I have steel coming out the right. And that's a pretty cool, it's really cool to see a belt of ingredients going in the left and a belt of outputs coming out the right. It just is really rewarding, and it kind of gives you this black box feel. And I really like that. And then if you have nesting turned on, then you can put a level 2 factory inside of a level 3 one. So that, it's like Russian nesting dolls. So inside the biggest building, you can put the medium building, and inside of the medium building, then you can put the small building. So you can get up to 3 layers deep. And at that point, you can fit not infinite, but you can fit a lot because the large buildings are very large. You could probably fit 6 to 10 of the medium buildings inside the large building, and then you can put small buildings inside those. So you could really go crazy with that, even without the infinite recursion. And then you can also set it so that you can just put any factory building inside of any factory building. And at that point, you have quite literally unlimited infinite space if you go deeper and deeper layers. And if you really want to, you can even design, some people have done this, and you can look this up on YouTube, what's it called? Well, they're recursive, but they're essentially set up with the connection so that you can just keep pasting the same building within itself, and it will process more and more and more of the same ingredient, which I think is a really cool way to design it. It's quite literally recursion in computer code, but in Factorio form. So definitely check out Factorissimo. It's a really cool mod. It is cheaty in some senses because you're fitting more stuff in less space. But once you play with it a bit more, it's not quite as cheaty as it seems, because it does increase the logistical complexity in the sense that you no longer can access what's inside the factory building with your bot network. And so if you want to use logistics bots, you actually have to make a bot network inside the building, and that adds some complexity. You can't just easily grab items, from inside the building with logistics bots or feed items into it. You have to feed them into the outside of the building, which then get transported inside the building, either with a chest, you can connect it with a logistics chest or a belt. And then once it's inside, you have to use a different bot network of bots to move that stuff around. Another way that it kind of adds complexity is that you can't access from map view anything within the factory. And so you can't upgrade buildings, you can't change the build, you can't change recipes. So it is actually a little bit of a downside sometimes to use Factorissimo. And it's not just all upside. it does obviously give you a lot of ability to manipulate space, which is kind of cool. So a belt on the outside might be going 30 tiles, but it's going past 300 tiles worth of production. And so you end up saving a lot on belts, and in some ways bots have a higher kind of throughput because they don't have to go as far to traverse as much of your factory. And so you don't need as many bots. So, I mean, you need fewer bots and fewer belts, but you also add some logistical complexity. And so it's definitely a trade-off. It's very fun if you've never tried it. Some people feel like, wow, that's too much cheating. But it's like, well, yeah, but it's a different challenge. It does change how you think about production. And I highly recommend trying it out if you haven't. Even just with Vanilla Factorio, it will add... it'll add a lot more to your gameplay, and it does feel, even though it's not an overhaul mod, it does feel like a very large gameplay modification. And I actually think that's a really cool way to do it. There's even a mod, I haven't tried this one, but it's in the back of my head of something that would be fun. There's a mod that sticks you inside a factory building from the start, and ore comes in from the outside, and you play the entire game within the factory buildings. And so obviously you unlock the ability to nest fairly early. And so you unlock more and more ore belts coming in from the outside. And so you just have to continually nest deeper and deeper until you have your entire, space rocket launching factory built within Factorissimo. So I've wanted to try that one for a while, actually. I think that would be cool. So yeah, that is Factorissimo. I highly recommend giving it a try. Let me know what you think if you've played with Factorissimo. I always like hearing about it because I think the mod creates some really interesting solutions. Let's move on to Factorio Friday Facts 414, titled Spoils of Agriculture. This is maybe one of the most exciting Factorio Friday Facts since the quality one, which was 375. At least for me, I think this might be the most exciting one, and we'll get into more of the why. But let's start with what even are they talking about? Well, if you listen to last week's podcast, you know that Gleba, or Gleba, has been announced, and that is the third of the middle planets. And it is a very swampy, kind of earthy, everything is alive and vibrant with life type planet. And we didn't really see any of the resources. I think they showed there was some stone ore somewhere in the video, and there might have been one other thing, but we didn't even really know what resources were on this planet. Obviously, there was the assumption that it's going to be some form of biological thing, which it is the case, but we didn't know. And turns out, yes, it is biological. There are two main types of plants, or just two types of plants that you can harvest on Gleba. And you can make what is called the agriculture tower, which is this awesome looking crane that kind of goes around and collects these plants. And I say plants, but they're more like small trees. In fact, compared to the trees on Nauvis, they're actually larger than that. And they've got like these red like bulbs on them of, who knows what kind of alien fruit. And we haven't seen what the other main plant looks like, but it's really cool looking. And the agriculture tower will harvest these, and it will, the output obviously goes into the building, which you can offload with inserters. And then you need to feed the agriculture tower with seeds, and it will replant the trees that it collects. So it is kind of a forestry type mechanism where it's planting and harvesting. And when you harvest the plant, you get just one particular item, which then you need to process into the separated seeds and products. So you can send the seeds back to the agriculture tower, and then you send the products on to be processed. I think in this example, it was called mash was the processed item. And so the tower, they also mentioned that the tower plants in like a grid pattern, which kind of helps it look artificial, because they don't want it to look too natural, right? We are building a factory after all. So it does plant the trees in a grid. And it also can only plant on certain type of ground. So at first you're going to have to build it in a particular location, but then later you research like a landfill that allows you to put this type of soil anywhere. So you can, then end up cultivating this wherever you want. Then, after you process it into mash, you send that onto the biochamber, which is used to process all the plant fruits into more industrial products like carbon fiber or a mysterious material that they call bioflux. But more on that later, they say. So we'll see what bioflux is, but we don't know yet. It looks like a really cool building. It's kind of a chemical processing plant vibe, but it's far more green. I mean, it's green inside, and it's got a green light on the outside, and it's got this vat full of goop, that's kind of like swirling around when you put stuff into it. So it's really cool. They did mention that the quirk is that it needs to be fed nutrients to operate. And I don't know if that's going to be like a fuel for the building or if that's just another ingredient in all of the recipes. But it is pretty cool. They do show bioplastic being made so that it will be another way to make plastic. And they said that it essentially replaces oil processing on this planet. So I presume there's also some form of fuel that you can make out of these biological ingredients and stuff. So I was a little bummed because with the other buildings on the other planets, they're massive upgrades to processing chains that are kind of already in the game. Like the Fulgora gives you these massive electronics factories that are huge boosts to your circuit production. And the Vulcanus gives you the metallurgy system that's a huge boost to all of your metals and stuff like gears and wires. But here, it kind of seems like a slightly more separate mechanic, and they didn't show, these massive boosts to things you're already making. Obviously, with plastic being an option, maybe it's a better way to make plastic, but they didn't say it that way. So I'm thinking it's more just like, if you want plastic on Gleba, rather than making it with oil, you'll make it with these products. But it's not like a flat out better way to make plastic, but I guess we'll see. Either way, I have been avoiding the main point of all of this, which is called spoilage. So spoilage is an entirely new mechanic that is so interesting, and we're going to be talking about this a lot in this episode. So I'm just going to read what they say kind of word for word in the FFF first, and then we'll talk about it. So they said, what are these weird white lines in the image above? Now we're getting into what makes Gleba really special. When fruit is harvested or most other biological products are made, it will eventually spoil, which turns it into a new item we call spoilage. So they show a GIF of a bunch of the kind of bio products on a belt, and they all have these little basically what look like health bars underneath them, and they're white health bars rather than like a green and red type thing. And that shows the spoilage meter, essentially, like how close is it to spoiling and turning into the spoilage item. They say this process is inevitable and can't be delayed. However, different items have different spoil times, ranging from about 2 hours to mere minutes. This means that there are ways to control the mechanic and optimize for getting a less spoiled product in the end. The reason why you're optimizing for a better product is because recipe results inherit their freshness from the ingredients. Meaning, when you craft a product out of a 30% spoiled ingredient, the product itself is also 30% spoiled. So let's stop right there. That is really interesting because that means as soon as you create it might even be the fruit that's collected from the tree in the beginning. It might be the mash. I'm not sure exactly where the spoilage process starts, but it's going to be really early on. As soon as that happens, you have started a clock, and that clock cannot be modified, right? Like the spoilage meter is ticking down, and now your goal is to get it to its final stage as fast as possible. And that is so cool to me because so far we haven't had any mechanics like that. So let's get back to the FFF. We'll discuss the game design what's the word I'm looking for? Not implementations, the game implications. We'll discuss the game design implications soon. But yeah, so basically they mention that, let me get back to the FFF. Sorry, I've got it pulled up on my screen here. Effectively, the spoilable items need to be perceived as temporary. And it's the throughput that matters, which they say throughput here, but I think it's more like the lifespan of the item that matters is what they really mean to say. Because higher throughput could still be a very long process. Anyway, we'll get back to that. So they talk about their design here. They say when they're considering the idea of timed life for items, one of the first questions was whether it should just disappear or turn into something. If they just disappeared, it'd be more convenient as you wouldn't need to worry about the spoilage that's accumulating on your belts and in inventories, but you also wouldn't know that something had spoiled as there's no traces of it. So they ended up going with the spoilage item actually existing. And they said there are multiple methods to get rid of it. You can burn it, you can process it in the recycler, which gives you a 25% chance to get spoilage back. So you just loop it in the recycler. And then the last option is you can actually create nutrients from the spoilage that starts already being half spoiled. So that's just kind of a way to turn your spoilage back into fuel for the bio vats or something like that, I guess. But it looks like it's a pretty small ratio. They show a GIF and it's putting in like 5 or 10 spoilage for every 1 nutrient you get out. So it's really just a way to recycle it into something useful rather than probably a good way to, create nutrients. And they say to avoid this mechanic being over the top and to allow meaningful decisions to be made, there are some items where their freshness doesn't contribute to the final product, as the final product isn't something that is spoilable. On the other hand, the new agricultural science packs do spoil, which reduces their value for research. So you will be incentivized to try to bring home the freshest science packs you can. Wow, that's crazy. So essentially, if you make a more mechanical item, I'm assuming like carbon fiber, because that's one of the things they talked about. I'm assuming carbon fiber does not have spoilage. So once you've made your carbon fiber, the spoilage is now over. And as long as you can make the carbon fiber before the ingredient chain ends up spoiling, then you're good to go, right? Even if you made it with a 99% spoiled item, you now have your carbon fiber and you're fine. But with the science packs, since they inherit the spoilage factor all the way from the beginning of the chain, you're going to need to quickly get the science packs in terms of time. And then you need to get those to wherever you're researching science as quickly as possible. So they say, where do they say it? So on top of optimizing the production chain, it'll also be meaningful to make a fast space platform to deliver them. And if you remember back to the space platform mechanics, I believe the smaller it is, the faster it goes. And so now you've got a mechanic on one planet that's actually modifying how much space you actually want to utilize on your space platforms because of the mechanic on the planet. And I think that's so neat how it's intertwining these different systems that they've set up organically, no pun intended. But it's actually intertwining these systems in a way that's not forced, but it's almost like emergent gameplay, right? It's like, oh, well, just because of how spoilage works, now it's impacting how we do things in other parts of the factory. And it's not even directly technically related in a gameplay way. So I think that's really cool. They also mention inserters have the ability to prioritize the freshest or the most spoiled items when picking up from inventories. And you can also filter out spoilage with splitters. And those are the main ways that you kind of sort it all out. And so, yeah, it's just really cool. They talk about how there's been some drastic changes, as they've been designing Gleba. They said initially we had about 10 plants, and then it was kind of a very broad but shallow experience. So they've reduced it all the way down to 2 plants, and the fruits are processed into a wider variety of items. So essentially you can have smaller farms and more factory, and that's kind of how they wanted the balance to feel, rather than tons of farms and plants everywhere without a ton of interesting processing going on. They also said you use the seeds for the biochambers and the soil tiles, and so you don't just kind of have infinite seeds from the start. So they say, all in all, we are very confident that the gameplay of Gleba is different enough to be interesting, yet builds on similar enough principles to feel familiar and, well, actually be fun. And they go on to talk about the visuals are subject to change, and the the 3D art for the agriculture tower. A lot of work went into that, which is, to be honest, very clear. It's a really cool looking building. So definitely check out this FFF if you haven't already. And then that's the end of their Friday Facts post. But let's talk a little bit more about this, because there's just such a lot, gameplay wise to talk about here. First of all, there's so many things that now matter that never mattered before. For example, how long is the belt between step A and step B in a processing chain? That never has really mattered before. The only thing that belt distance has changed is like, how long does it take you, the player, to walk between the two parts? And the other thing that it's changed is like how much or how many items are buffered on the belt, right? But buffers kind of don't matter in Factorio. Right? Most of the time you're building in such a way that your belt buffers are just kind of backed up. And then so you've essentially kind of spent those items once, but then once it's backed up, all that matters is the throughput. And so here, if your belt is 10 tiles longer, now the items are going to be more spoiled by the time they get to that assembler. And then when you create the products with that assembler, the products of that assembler will be more spoiled. And now you've made this ticking time bomb, have more ticks. And so you're actually going to be incentivized to build closer together for all the steps, rather than what a lot of people have done with trains especially is like, oh, I have these really highly efficient, distinct processing areas where I do all of my, iron plates here. And then there's some other place where I do all of my iron gears. And on Gleba, that's not going to be the case. You're going to want to set up like A, B, C, D, E all in a row so that you can process to that final science pack as quickly as possible. And then you're going to have a lot of separate areas where you're going to want to do A, B, C, D, E. And then you're going to have all of the E's really close to where you can load that onto your rocket and get it to the space platform so you can go to your research. There's also the question of, can you bring the other research to Gleba and just do all your research on Gleba? And that might be a thing as well. I'm not really sure if there's any restrictions on research. If there is, they haven't said there is. So that might be another strategy that people want to do, is just set up their main research factory on Gleba so that, you don't have to lose as much spoilage. As far as questions that I have, there's a little bit of, unanswered stuff in the Friday Facts, which is like, how does it work in inventories exactly? Does it stack items with similar spoilage? Does it sort the spoilage, or is it just kind of all randomly thrown into the chest in the order it was inserted? In terms of modding, can modules themselves have spoilage? Can entities have spoilage? Is it just intermediates that can have spoilage? There's a lot of questions kind of in the back of my mind like that. Can spoilage be cyclical? Which would be, again, a modding question. And I think it can, based on a meme post by Rygard on the Reddit. He basically made an animated item. And he said the spoilage allows, is a pathway to abilities that many consider unnatural. And it was like a gif of like a little anime character, like shaking their head back and forth, because essentially every tick it was spoiling into a different item, which was a slightly, different frame of the animation. And so it was just constantly spoiling into the next thing. And it did look like it was repeating. So I do think you could have some sort of cyclical spoilage, which would be really interesting. So there's so many little things. A lot of people were hoping you can remove the white line from the items showing on the screen, because they're, in some ways, they're kind of useless. Like it's helpful to look at once in a while, like how spoiled are my items at this stage of processing? How spoiled are they at this stage? But once you've set up a production line, the individual spoilage of items isn't really going to be that important anymore, because you've already set it up to process everything in a certain speed, and you've already set up your spoilage recycling. And so once things are set up, I don't think you really want that little white health bar on all your items. I don't think it looks very good. So I'm with the people that are hoping that we can turn that off. Anyway, yeah, so I'll talk more about this mechanic in broad strokes kind of when we get to the main topic. But as far as it pertains to Factorio, I think it's really cool because of beacons. We've already talked about beacons a little bit because they did the beacon rework. But with this mechanic, there's yet another reason to not just build as many beacons as possible. Because the more beacons you have, the further items are going to have to travel to get to the assemblers, right? Because if you're doing, let's say you have beacons all over the place, well, now you have to pass by a beacon and then to get to assembler number 1, and then there's 2 more beacons between assembler 1 and 2, and it just kind of goes on like that. And so now you're wanting to figure out, how can I get the most processing done in the smallest amount of space, which you'll definitely want to use beacons for that, so you can process 2 or 3 times as many items in the close space, but it won't be the classic build. So I'm very excited about that in particular. And even, buffers, well, buffers are going to be a bad deal, right? If you're buffering these bio items, they're just going to spoil. And so you're going to have this constant recycling loop of spoilage and a constant collection. Or maybe people will be smart and they'll be like, well, if I don't need chemical science, or I'm calling it chemical science, we'll call it bioscience. If I don't need bioscience, or I guess they told me the name, what was it? Agricultural science packs. So if you don't need the agricultural science packs, maybe you'll just disable the harvester in the first place. So you won't harvest any fruit until there's a need for the packs, because it is the lifespan from start to finish that matters, not the throughput. So yeah, it's really interesting. Dave's mentioning that you always want to use the best belt, even if throughput doesn't matter. Exactly. Like if you have blue belts, they're going to be better than yellow belts for this, even if you're only doing 1 item a second. It does open a ton of options for mods, which is very exciting. Aylor is saying that it probably will end up looking like a lot of direct insertion, from one building to the next building to the next building, so that you're really minimizing the spoiling time. Detrumi is thinking about how science multipliers will interact with the agricultural science, because it is going to be harder to mass produce agricultural science, which I actually think is really interesting, because if you need twice as much agricultural science, it will require more than twice as much infrastructure to create that, because inevitably, the more you're making, it is going to create more spoilage on average. I don't think there's a way that you can double your agricultural science without getting a little bit more spoilage. Obviously, by having a build that's really efficient and copy pasting it, you'll end up with the same kind of, let's say it gets you to a 10% spoiled science pack. You can copy paste that, and then you'll still have the same harvest to agricultural pack time. But you still have to get those packs to space, and you have to get those packs in space to where you're researching. And I'm guessing the more you try to move, the slower that process is going to look. So yeah, it's going to be really interesting. I'm excited to see where this all goes in the Factorio sense. But again, I'll talk about a little bit more of the game design here in a minute. So I think that's all I wanted to say for the FFF. And the main topic of today is innovation in automation gaming. And this hits on, we talk about all this stuff a lot, right? There's a lot of overlap in the topics on this podcast, because we've hit on things like quality before, but I haven't actually discussed quality, because that FFF came out before the podcast started. So I haven't had just a long talk about that. And that is a completely new mechanic. As far as I'm aware, no other automation / factory games have really done the quality mechanic. And there are so many games coming out these days that it's very possible a smaller, indie game has done something similar, but definitely none of the big ones do anything similar. And spoilage now is a mechanic that, again, I'm looking at it and I'm like, has anyone else done this? Not really. Ultra Cube as a mod did something that's almost similar, where it's like the time that the cube is on the belt actually matters for your base's overall production. But that's still a very different take on that concept, and it has a lot of different ramifications. So spoilage in my head is like, this is a new mechanic for the genre. This hasn't been done before. The amount of like having an item with a limited lifespan, kind of a hot potato, you know, and it's like this potato needs to stay hot, and as soon as it cools off, it's done. It's useless. That mechanic hasn't really been done yet, and I think it adds a lot to the genre, and it's worth talking about the implications it has on, you know, as people are designing these games or making, you know, expansions or mods for these games, how to use this concept, how to use this idea of items with a limited lifespan in a way that's effective, because obviously it's a very annoying mechanic. Like, this is at the core, this is a bad thing, which, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's a bad mechanic and Wooba has made a mistake. What I'm saying is, to a player, your items, you know, turning into rotten crap is a bad thing, right? Like, you don't want that to happen. In almost every case, you don't want the rotten stuff, you want the fresh stuff. And so having a timer on your items is a bad thing. And so as a game dev, you have to ask, well, how do we make it fun? How do we make it interesting? How do we make it rewarding so that it's not a bad thing that this mechanic exists? It's a fun challenge, right? And sometimes the line between bad, annoying mechanic and fun, challenging mechanic is very thin, and it's very gray, and it's hard to walk on the fun, challenging mechanic side of that rather than the annoying, not fun mechanic. I think we touched on that dichotomy a little bit with the inventory idea, right? If your inventory is too small and inventory management is too annoying, then it's not fun. But if your inventory is just effectively infinite and there's zero challenge to inventory management, then, well, now you've potentially missed out on something that could make your game better. So I want to talk about spoilage. I want to talk about quality. I want to talk about stacking. That is a mechanic that's been done before, but I do think it's a pretty rare one. The only instance I know of it in the bigger games is Dyson Sphere program. Allows you to stack and unstack items with they're kind of like inline things that you put on the belt that actually stack the items, and then you can just consume the stacked items, or you can unstack them with unstackers. And then recycling is also a mechanic that I think is more or less unutilized. You know, Satisfactory has the awesome sink, but that's not so much recycling as just like burning all of your unwanted items, and it just happens to give you like these kind of secondary currency points for fun stuff. So spoilage as a mechanic is a completely different way to incentivize players to produce things. In all factory games so far, it's always about throughput, right? It doesn't really matter, apart from the spin up time, it doesn't really matter how long it takes for an iron ore to be turned into a steel plate. If it's a 10-minute journey, okay, fine. If it's a 30-minute journey, okay, fine. It doesn't really matter, because you're always thinking in terms of how many steel plates do I need per minute or per second, or what, you know, whatever time frame you want to use. And if you need 10 steel plates per minute, it doesn't really matter if that iron ore takes 30 minutes to become those 10 steel. That only matters the first time. Once things are flowing, they just keep flowing forever, right? And unless it's a process that's constantly getting interrupted, in that case, you know, the spin up time might matter. But more or less in these factory games, the spin up time is pretty insignificant. And I see people talk about this a lot. And sometimes people, you know, are talking about situations where it might matter. But in the vast majority of cases, in most factory games, the spin up time is irrelevant. And that's why in Satisfactory, most people use manifold loading into their buildings rather than like, oh, I perfectly balance these things before they go into the processing. Instead, they just do the manifold, which is where they put a splitter into the first building and then one side of the splitter goes to the next splitter, which goes into the second building, and then one side of that splitter goes into the next one, which goes into the third building. And this essentially ends up wasting some items because at first, half of your items are going into the first building, even if you have 10 buildings. And that ends up, wasting the entire buffer of that building. So it has to fill up the first building completely. And then once that's backed up, now the first building is only consuming what it's supposed to be consuming. And so you end up, spending, in most cases, it's 100 extra items per building, but you don't really care because once it's all, firing on all cylinders, it will keep firing on all cylinders forever. And so most people in Satisfactory just go with the manifold splitting and don't look back. And similarly in Factorio, it's not quite a manifold because inserters tend to be used, and inserters are a little smarter, and they do have a little bit of an internal buffer that they keep in the building, but it's not a huge amount. So even though technically it's kind of the same thing in Factorio, you don't notice it as much. But spoilage, well, that changes everything, right? Because now if your item has a huge throughput, but it takes longer to make, is that better? And you kind of have this A times B formula happening now, whereas before all that mattered was throughput. Now it's throughput multiplied by spoilage. And so if you can get twice as much throughput, but it's only 20% more spoilage at the end of the day, well, that might be worth it, right? Even though it's slightly more spoiled, you're still getting a lot more of it. But you have to consider the ramifications of having your belts go a little further or having a little bit more space between this section of buildings and this other section of buildings, right? And it's like normally you're like, oh, I like to space things out. You're trying to design a clean factory. You're trying to space things out so they look nice. Well, are you going to do that now? Like this even affects the aesthetics of your base. And that's so cool to me because currently aesthetics is very much a choice that the player makes where it's like, okay, the only cost to spacing things out really is that I have to walk a little further and maybe I have to spend a few more resources on belts or bots or trains because things are a little further away. But it's not going to affect the throughput. It's not going to affect the bottom line. Now it will. With spoilage, now even the way that you visually want your base to look has a gameplay ramification. Now, this could be a bad thing, right? Because some players are really going to chafe on that point that I just made because they're like, oh, well, I want to build these really aesthetically pleasing bases, but that's going to be less efficient for spoilage, and I don't like that. Like, I want to be able to have the best game mechanic for spoilage or the best way to do it, and I want my base to look beautiful in the ways that I want it to look beautiful, which may not, sometimes a good looking base will be antithetical to unspoiled items. So I think some players are actually going to find that to be a negative. And as a dev, you have to be really careful with that. It seems like they've done a decent job of thinking about those things, but I am anticipating there will be some Factorio players that are not going to like this mechanic as a whole. I think overall it will be pretty popular, but I think there will be a subset of players that actually don't like it. And that's okay. Everyone's allowed to have their opinions, but it does have a big enough impact even on something like aesthetics that I think there are going to be some players that aren't a fan. Me personally, I'm a huge fan. I think it's going to add a lot to the gameplay. I'm excited to kind of play with the challenge. Excuse me, the throat's getting a little dry. I'm excited to play with the challenge that spoilage introduces. And I don't know, I just think it's really fun. It's fun to watch your items rotting. There's something that feels, there's something that feels very real about that. It feels very realistic. When you think about actual real life logistics of food, it's how it works, right? Now, you can freeze food, but still, like, how long before you freeze it? How long after you freeze it? When does it get defrosted? When does it get thawed? Where does it get sold? How long can it be on the shelves, right? Like, all of these things matter a lot. And it's introducing a more or another, I should say, another kind of very realistic mechanic in real life logistics to our factory games. And I don't know. I don't know what else to say other than I think that's really cool. And I think it will be really neat to see where Factorio goes with this and where other games go with this, because Factorio is the GOAT, right? It is the leader of the industry. And I don't think, while I do think it's not everybody's favorite factory game, I do think most people agree it is the GOAT, right? It is still ahead of the Dyson Sphere program and the Satisfactory in terms of like where they are in the pack. I don't know in terms of actual sales if that's true, but in terms of kind of originality and influence and well, I guess with those two in specific, I'm quite confident that Factorio is the leader. So when the leader does something, all the followers are gonna have their eyes on it, right? And so I'm gonna guess that we're gonna see a lot more games introduce in coming updates, as well as new games that are coming out have this mechanic of limited item lifespans. And I'm really excited to see where that goes, because I think it's really cool. I think we're going to see a lot of devs do it poorly, and it's going to backfire, and their players are going to hate it. And I think we're going to see a lot of devs do it really well, and it's going to add some cool kind of twists on gameplay that we love to see. A couple people on Twitch are talking about the devs have said they prefer spaghetti bases, so it's possible that is kind of this is almost a way that the game itself wants you to have a little bit more spaghetti rather than perfectly laid out blocks with lots of space in between. There will be mods that will probably disable spoilage, for people that want to. And inversely, there will be mods that add spoilage to more things. Your iron plates spoil into pieces of rust, and you have to turn them into stainless iron real quick, or I don't know. There's going to be all sorts of cool mods on that people are going to use real quick, I'm sure. And what about, can place entities spoil? That is an interesting question. Like, can you have buildings that only last for so long until they spoil into something else? That would be really interesting as well. I'm not sure what under the hood the game allows you to do. So yeah, that's kind of some overall thoughts on spoilage. What are some other ways that innovation has occurred in the Factorio Friday Facts? Well, quality, like I said, as far as I'm aware, is not a mechanic that's been done in any other game. So it is another step forward in the industry, in the genre, that Factorio is taking with this expansion. And I'm far less confident about. With spoilage, I can look at it from the outside and be fairly confident that it is a positive thing, as long as you're careful about how annoying it is to manage. The idea of items having lifetimes adds a lot of really cool logistical challenges, and the downsides are fairly small, and you can mitigate those downsides, by just playtesting your game and making sure that you don't, screw over players too easily. So I think spoilage is a little bit of a more clear-cut one. Quality is less clear-cut to me. There are a lot of downsides to quality, and it's not immediately clear if the mechanic is kind of just a magical, great mechanic that most games should have. I do think quality is going to be really fun in Factorio. I think the way that Wooba playtests their game is really well done. So I'm very confident it will be great for Factorio. But as a mechanic for the genre, I'm not immediately confident that it should be in most factory games. And it's a little hard because you're imagining the mechanic being shoehorned into games that already exist in your head. And that's not really going to work, because the game kind of has to be designed with it in mind, right? So if you imagine it being in Satisfactory, oh my gosh, it sounds like a pain, because you'd have to sort out so many things. And Satisfactory doesn't really do sorting, not easily at least. And it would just be such a pain to have to sort low quality items out, or, try to get your high. I would not want quality in Satisfactory, just on the face of it. There's probably a world where it could be made fun, but it would be a very different world than the one that exists in SF already. So quality, it begs a lot of questions. In Factorio in particular, there's 5 tiers of quality, is that too many tiers? Like, that's a lot. That's a lot of different items running around your base with different little colored dots on them. And I'm not completely certain that 5 is the right number. Honestly, having just 2 or 3 feels like it would still add a lot to the gameplay while not massively inflating kind of the different amounts of things that exist. Sorry, my brain goes so many places when I talk about stuff like this. But what I'm thinking about right now is readability of the game. When a player of Factorio posts a screenshot right now of vanilla Factorio, obviously with mods, this can be a little different. But when a player posts a vanilla screenshot with alt mode turned on, you know exactly what's happening in that screenshot. And if you were to place the same buildings in the same places, your version of whatever that thing is, whether it's a nuclear power plant or a coal boiler setup or steel plates, is going to work exactly the same. But with quality, well, were they using, rare power poles, or were they using uncommon power poles? Because those are going to have a different wire reach and those will connect differently. And now it's like every single item, the quality that it is going to impact what kinds of blueprints you can make. And so if you've got uncommon items, your blueprint for steel production might look a little different than if you've got rare items. And when I say items, I mean like entities, like the furnaces, the power production is kind of a separate blueprint, but the furnaces, the inserters, the power poles, and the beacons and the modules, are all things where quality will impact the way that they process your items. And so your blueprints are going to look different. And you might even be mixing quality, right? Because in your base, you might have a really great quality increase set up for modules. So you're getting like rare and maybe even epic modules, but you don't have that same setup, or you wouldn't really be able to transfer that setup to making furnaces. So maybe you've still got regular or just uncommon furnaces, but you've got rare and epic modules in your beacons going. And so you set up this blueprint and it's great. And now that blueprint is essentially yours and yours alone, because how many other people have the same subset of, modules and furnaces and power poles all at the same time? And in some ways, I think that's maybe a good thing, right? Because it makes players' experiences more unique, because the things that you have on hand at a given time are probably not going to be exactly the same. But there's also the downside of, well, now your experience is less transferable to other players. So when you're talking about how you're playing the game and how it feels to play the game and what you're doing and what you're enjoying and what you're not enjoying, then other players are actually going to have a harder time relating their experience to yours, because their experience might have been completely different. Which again, it's a pro and a con, right? Because having different experiences amongst players is going to increase excitement, because you're like, ooh, I like what you're talking about, and the way that you got to experience that actually sounds more fun than the way I got to experience it. So next time I play, I want to try doing it that way. And that's actually a positive. So I don't know. I just think it's interesting to think about it that way, because that's not how Factorio is right now. With the exception of, decisions like, do I want to do trains more or bots more? Or do I want to do the pink science or the yellow science first? There's not too many decision points that players can differ on. Those are two different words. There's not too many places where players can differ, and their conversations with each other would almost feel like you're kind of playing a different thing than I'm playing right now. And I don't know. I just think that's such a cool thing. It does come with some cons, and it's worth thinking about those cons. If you're developing a game or a mod, what are the downsides to players having these different experiences? A mod maker has to ask these questions when they add options to their mod, because then people who are playing their mod are going to have different experiences, whether that option is checked on or off. And if that option's off, are they going to, are players with that option off going to be able to kind of talk about their experience and relate to each other, or is it going to kind of turn it into two separate games? And I think you have to do the same thing with the idea of quality. Are your items going to be of all these different qualities? Is that adding enough to your game that it's worth kind of splitting off and fracturing your player base into all these different categories of, okay, these people don't care about quality at all. They're literally beating the game without quality. These people over here, they're rushing quality. They're trying to get, rare and epic and maybe even legendaries as soon as possible. And those two players are going to have a very different experience, and they're going to jive less. They're going to share blueprints less. They're going to, in some ways, they're playing different games. Is that a good thing? And again, I've kind of talked about that already. There are a lot of pros to that, but there are some cons to that. And it's worth remembering there are some cons to that. It's not all good. I think in the case of Factorio, it's going to be quite good. And the cons, I think, are mostly mitigated, and they're not going to be big enough to matter too much. But they are there, and I don't want to skip over them. I probably have lots more thoughts on quality as a mechanic overall. Like, what does it even add to the game? I'm starting to go long in the tooth already on this topic, but I've kind of wondered, like, do we need 5 tiers? Is it even realistic? Like, we're in real life, it's more like tolerances, and there is, different items. I guess there might be this concept of higher or lower quality, but it's more just like, is it good enough to be what it's supposed to be or not? Like, if you're making screws, as long as they fit within the tolerance that they need to be within, then it's perfect, right? There's no difference between a good enough thing and a slightly better thing, because they're both screws that are going to do what you need to do. And if you're talking about like actually higher quality screws, well, those are going to be made out of a actually different metal, right? It's not like you just processed it slightly better. And so it's really hard to imagine like, oh, well, you just somehow magically made this thing operate better, even with all the same ingredients, and I guess you're considering the higher quality iron that you're putting in leads to a higher quality screw. I don't know. It kind of makes sense, but it does feel a little bit gamey to me. And it feels even more gamey when you put the words uncommon, rare, epic, and legendary on them. I'm still not really sold on that. I will get used to it, I'm sure, but I don't like it yet. So yeah, I don't know. This idea of quality, and like, if you have a higher quality item in Factorio, it's just better. But in real life, it's like, it might just be better, but it might not be any better for the application you're using it for. And you're probably just going to sell it for more money, right? That's how things tend to work in real life, is if your company makes a better quality product than the other one, it's usually more expensive. And there's no money in Factorio. And so it's just the concept of quality. It's like, what are we really doing here? We're making, essentially, if you boil it down, we're making more tiers of buildings. Now power poles have tiers, even though yes, there is only one medium power pole. Well, now there's uncommon medium power poles, and those are going to have a longer wire reach and more, power range. And so they're essentially adding another tiering system to all of the things that quality affects. So now you've got module 1, 2, and 3, but you've also got uncommon, rare, epic, and legendary modules. And you've got all the combinations of those. And that starts to get even more convoluted, because you've got uncommon module 2s, but is that better or worse than a rare module 2 versus an uncommon module 3, or maybe just even a regular module 3? And now you're trying to compare and contrast, like, which one's cheaper, which one can I make more of? And again, it's like, yes, there are pros to that. That's a fun challenge. And there are also cons to that. It's really freaking confusing. And you need a spreadsheet for that, right? And Factorio hasn't really needed a spreadsheet for vanilla. You can do a lot in vanilla without feeling like you kind of need a spreadsheet. And that's not going to be true with quality. Even someone just messing around with quality is very quickly going to be like, oh my gosh, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of numbers that aren't just behind the scenes, but they're like coming out at me. And I kind of need to think about how all those numbers work together. And there's many steps. And it's like that number is applied, and then this number is applied, and how does it? So I do think there is a lot of downside to quality. It adds a lot of complexity, is the simplest way to put it. And does it add an equivalent amount to be worth it of challenge and fun? I hope so. I think so. I like complexity, so I in particular am excited about quality. But from a design perspective, I can see a lot of the downsides pretty clearly. And that being said, I don't think it's a mechanic that games should just include willy-nilly and be like, oh, Factorio's doing it, we should do it too. They've done it really carefully, and I'm sure they've had a lot of these same conversations that I'm talking about right now in their dev team. And so if you're going to put quality in your game, you want to think really carefully about it. Is the juice worth the squeeze, right? Like, is it actually going to add more to your game, or is it complexity that's going to subtract from your game? And I think quality can pretty easily slide into the complexity that's not worth it category. So that's kind of all I have to say for now. Quality is such an interesting topic that I'm sure we'll continue talking about it more on this podcast a lot. But for now, I'm going to move on. I do want to talk about two more little things and then we'll wrap up. Stacking as a mechanic is really interesting. They revealed the stack inserter, the new and improved stack inserter. They were calling it the bulk inserter, and then we all rioted as the players on the Reddit and were like, it makes no sense that the thing that actually stacks items is called the bulk inserter, and the stack inserter does not stack items. So I think they saw the logic of that and agreed after a lot of the player base was also saying that. And they're like, okay, fine, we'll rename it. They just didn't want to rename it at first because it is a little confusing to rename from vanilla to the expansion. But in this case, I think it's worth it. All that to say, stacking items, if you don't know, the new stack inserter will actually be able to place multiple items on the same piece of belt. So right now, you can only fit 8 items per belt tile, and there's kind of 4 on each lane. Well, now you can stack items, so you could fit stacks of 2 on each of those little 8 slots. So it's literally doubling your throughput once you have stack size of 2, and it's tripling your throughput when you have stack size of 3. And that is an independent throughput increase from the belt speed. And so it's a cool way, talking about more tiers with quality. Well, this is kind of like more tiers of belt throughput. And it also, I don't know how bots interact with stacking. I guess they don't, because stacking only exists on belts. So it's a cool way to be able to increase throughput that doesn't affect trains and it doesn't affect bots. So I actually really like the stacking mechanic. I think the way they're doing it in Factorio is quite different than Dyson Sphere Program, and I think it works really well. And I actually am starting to think about Satisfactory, and I'm like, especially because there's not 2 lanes in Satisfactory, and because setting up belts is a lot more of a hassle in Satisfactory, just due to the first-person nature of the game. It is harder to set up belts. I actually think stacking could be a really cool way to be able to kind of do more with the belts you've already made in Satisfactory. So kind of just thinking off the top of my head, I do think Satisfactory could have a home for the stacking mechanic in the future. It would be a huge change, of course, but I think it could be a cool one, especially just because of how hard belts are to make. And I think that in the more general design sense for factory games, if creating beltways is difficult, you want to give the player more improvements and more options for both sorting and throughput, right? So when I think about games like Factorio, it's kind of fine if your belts don't have a ton of throughput because you can just copy paste 50 belts right next to each other so easily. So stacking in some ways isn't needed. I do think they wanted to improve the throughput of individual belts because mega bases literally had 20 blue belts next to each other, and I think they were like, yeah, we maybe need something a little better for the top end of these bases, and stacking can provide that. But when you look at Satisfactory, it's really a pain in the butt to make 20 belts of, and the tier of belt doesn't really matter, they're all the same difficulty to build. But it's kind of a pain in the butt to build 20 belts next to each other, far more than it is in Factorio. And so I would actually think mechanics like stacking and even mechanics that would allow players to put sushi onto a belt more easily, I think mechanics like, and when I say sushi, for those who don't know, what I mean is mixing different item types on a belt in such a way that they don't get blocked up. Like if you have a long pipeline between a mine and your base, and you mine two different things in that mine. And in Satisfactory, maybe that's coal and Caterium. So you've got coal and Caterium, and you only need a little bit of each, because maybe you're not using coal power plants. You just need a little bit for explosives or whatever. And you only need a little bit of each, but you don't want to make two belts go all the way across the map. So a sushi belt would be one that somehow has coal and Caterium on the same belt, but only as much as you need of either one. And right now, Satisfactory doesn't really have a good way to do that. Like you could alternate left, right, left, right, left, right. But then what if you need twice as much Caterium as coal? How do you tell that to the splitter? You just can't really do it. And I think devs being able to add mechanics that give more power to players in the sense of like, I can use one belt for multiple things. Or with stacking, which is what this is kind of all about, is it's like I can put more items on one belt. And so the pain of it's kind of a lot of work to make my belt is lessened because now I can unlock this mechanic that allows me to put more on that one belt. And obviously they have faster belts that you unlock, and that's one way that the pain can be reduced. But I think stacking is a great way to also reduce that pain. And you can be like, okay, well now, because I have stacking, I can use, previously maybe I had two belts coming from this big iron mine really far away. But now that I have stacking, I can stack it all into one belt, and I can extend that second belt that's now empty and throw that over to this quartz mine. And then I don't have to work as hard to make that quartz mine. And you really feel like you got something, for your work. And it feels like the work you did previously is kind of paying off extra later. So I think stacking is a pretty cool mechanic, and it rewards the players in some ways. And I think it's actually really at home in the first person factory games where it is just more difficult, literally, like in terms of time and effort to build belts. Okay, I'm moving on to recycling as my last thing to think about as a kind of fresh and new take in the factory genre. It's not quite new. A lot of mods have added recycling of items. There's multiple Factorio mods that do it. There's probably Satisfactory mods that do it. Where you throw an item back into the recycler and it gives you back the ingredients. So it's not a new mechanic in that sense. It's not like, oh, we haven't seen this before. But I do think the way that they're incorporating it into a core experience of the game is new. Right. On Fulgora, which is the lightning planet, it's literally a mechanic for how you collect things, because what you're mining from the ground is scrap stuff. It's scrap. It's not ore. And so to get what you need, you actually have to mine the scrap, and then it's not giving you ore. It's giving you things like copper cables or iron plates. And so you're having to sort out kind of these level 1 products from your mining rather than what you normally do, which is you mine stuff and then you smelt it into plates and then you turn that into level 1 products. So it's just a really different take where recycling is used as kind of a core part of the production line. And I do think recycling is also going to be used in other ways that we haven't seen yet, because they're putting it as a main mechanic in Gleba, and we already know it's a main mechanic on Fulgora. They haven't really shown any major ways that we're going to need it or use it on Vulcanus. And it's a major component of quality, right? And so to get higher quality items, well, you get rid of the lower quality ones because you're not looking for those. And so it's kind of like you keep re-rolling the loot box for, over and over again with recycling. And so it's just, they've incorporated recycling, kind of, they're weaving it in and out of the experience. And I think that that's very different than what most mods have done with it, which is just, hey, you don't need this building anymore, so chuck it into the recycler and you'll get kind of some of your money back. And I think that's how Satisfactory does it, right? Like, hey, you don't need this thing anymore, so we'll give you some awesome points for it. Or in some cases, if you like all of the decorations, you actually need to produce things specifically to put in the Awesome Sync. But, in terms of pure gameplay, the Awesome Sync is really just like, hey, this is a thing you can do with your old stuff and you get some sort of little boost. But instead, Factorio is saying, we're going to weave this concept of recycling throughout the game experience. You're not just going to use it for stuff that you don't care about anymore. And I think that's really cool. And I'm excited to see if and how they incorporate it into the 5th and final planet. Whew. Wow, that was a lot. Sorry that we went so long today. These are just really fun things to talk about. And I'm really excited to hear what you guys think about these topics. So please leave a comment. If you're watching on the YouTube VOD on Krydex Extra, we'll just leave a comment here on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify or Apple or whatever, follow the link to the Krydania Discord. We're all friendly. There's a ton of people there. We talk about all sorts of games and have a lot of fun. And please head over to the Discord and just leave a comment in there on the TFMG discussion channel. That stands for The Factory Must Grow. And yeah, just let me know what you think about things. I love talking about this stuff, and I'd love to hear what you guys have to think too. If you disagree, I'd love to hear, what your thoughts are. If you agree, then, what are your takes on things? I think these conversations are so interesting and I love having them. That's why this podcast exists. And I want to hear what you guys have to say too. So please head over there and let me know what you think. There are now 2 ways to support the podcast. You can head over to patreon.com/Krydax, or you can hit the support button, which should be in the about section of the podcast. I also want to thank my sponsor. Wait. Nope, just kidding. I don't have a sponsor. I'd love one though. For Raid Shadow Legends, if you guys are listening, I'll throw your name out there if you want to give me some money. All jokes aside, next week the podcast will be streamed not at the regular time, but Galdoc and I are going to be doing a question and answer episode. And so if you have any questions for Galdoc or myself, and it can be about anything, not just factory games, you can, leave that question in any of the places I just talked about. And the cast will be Monday at 11:30 instead of Sunday at 11. So that is Monday, June 17th, 11:30 a.m. Eastern, which is 3:30 p.m. UTC. And yeah, as usual, if you've got anything to say, head over to the normal places. I'll put links to all those in the description. Thank you guys so much for listening. I always have a blast on this podcast, and I hope you do too. We'll see you next week. And always remember, the factory must grow.